to pass the word to Sérgio Quintela, that's the Vice President of the Getúlio Vargas Foundation.
Bom, é com muita satisfação que a Fundação Getúlio Vargas hoje está recebendo aqui, recebemos há pouco um breve almoço e agora com uma palestra. O professor, além de ser um reputado economista indiano, é um homem de experiência internacional, foi professor até pouco tempo atrás na Inglaterra e desenvolve estudos, eu diria, inovadores no campo da medida da riqueza das nações, e acredito que ele fará algumas reflexões sobre isso. É um tema, eu diria, novo, relativamente novo, tem poucos anos atrás, que ele desenvolveu e publicou. Talvez alguns de vocês tenham tido a oportunidade de ler uma matéria recente do Economist, que cuidava especificamente dos trabalhos de pesquisa dele nesse sentido, de maneira que acredito que para vocês e para nós todos a palestra do professor será muito interessante, muito importante, e abre alguns caminhos novos para a pesquisa que a Fundação Getúlio Vargas, a EPGE, o IBRE e as demais unidades da Fundação certamente vão procurar. É um professor muito ligado a assuntos de economia e economia ambiental, de maneira que nos dá muito prazer recebê-los a todos e dar início, então, à apresentação que ele veio a fazer, e acho que o Aloisio vai fazer uma breve apresentação com mais detalhes sobre o professor. Boas-vindas a todos e espero que seja uma boa programação para essa tarde.
Prometi aos alunos que hoje nós estaremos aqui fazendo um tripé com o que já havíamos visto na aula magna da semana passada, a questão de capital humano, formação de pessoas, principalmente na idade mais tenra, 0 a 3 anos e assim por diante, que é um assunto de pesquisa do Aloisio. Depois a parte institucional e hoje, finalmente, vamos ter a parte ambiental, que é tão crucial quanto as outras duas e que provavelmente deverá gerar muita pesquisa dos nossos alunos no futuro. Muito obrigado. Bem-vindo a todos.
Okay, I make the introduction in English. Thank you to Sergio and Rubens. And it's a really great honor for us here in Getúlio Vargas Foundation and EPGE to have the visit of such a distinguished scientist, Sir Partha Dasgupta. Is emeritus on Cambridge University. He is a member of the National Academy of Science of the United States of America, a fellow of the Royal Society in England, of the British Academy of Science, has many distinguished positions, but more than that, he is a very deep scientist, an important theorist, has done work at the Nobel Prize range, in this continuous game, on asymmetric information, had distinguished co-authors like Stiglitz, Nobel Prize winner, and Eric Maskin, and he's very early started on environmental economics, as a pioneer in the field. It's a very important book with Jeff Hill, Natural Resource, not allocation of natural resource. He's not a latecomer in this issue, and he keeps doing more and more. He shows us that very experienced research can still innovate. That's very important for everybody that start working scientifically, but also for people like me that have many years, and many professors that have many years already of research, and he keeps innovating. And then his last work is in a different way of looking at GDP, taking into consideration the stock of human capital, of natural resource, of physical capital, and so forth, and measuring the flow from that. He took enormous attention They draw enormous attention from the press and from the scientific community and from policymakers, and his work has been seen as a new guideline to think seriously about environmental issues, about depletion of natural resource and so forth. It is a great pleasure for us to receive Sir Partha Dasgupta, eminent scientist, last but not least, from, I should say, India dash Bangladesh, but you're born in Pakistan or Bangladesh, and but educated in India, right? Originally educated in England, so that's important for us also that live the less privilege in terms of education regions that can go very far. And it's a great pleasure, and also to talk something that's so pertinent to the interests of this house, to do policy making in environmental issues. Thank you very much. I want to make a small comment. He mentioned it to me that he wants to take a small question during his talk, okay? Leave the big question for afterwards, but the small one, so don't start the big question in the middle of his talk. But he told me he wants to take the small question along the way.
Thank you very much. It is a great honor and a pleasure to be here. And I notice that the bulk of the audience are students, and I have been a professor for more years than any of you among students was born. So I will be addressing you, and I'm going to ignore the professors. Because I want you to take, in some sense, share a kind of an obsession I've had for many, many years, dating back to the time I was a PhD student myself, in trying to grapple not with big questions, somehow the big questions become big after you slice through small questions. So I'm a small questions man, but I will want to take you this next hour or so from a whole sequence of small questions and then see what we can do to illuminate an answer to them. The particular attitude that I want you to adopt for this afternoon is an attitude that we all have, I think, pretty much every day. And that is an attitude of citizenship. We don't have it all the time, and that's probably a very good thing, by the way. And if everybody was a citizen all the time, life would be intolerable, because we wouldn't have any time to discover our own selves. But usually it's in the morning at breakfast that we are citizens. We read the newspaper or hear the radio, and we feel things aren't going very well. The reports aren't very good. Policies are being taken which we do not care about. Some, of course, we do care about. And when we think about those policies, bear in mind, mostly we don't say to ourselves, what is in it for me? It's the rare occasion when we ask ourselves, are they right for the general good? Or for others whom we might care about? Not relatives, but groups of people whom we think ought not to be excluded. It is a remarkable phenomenon, I think, one of the virtues of society, that when we vote, we don't really go to the polling booth with our own interests in mind. We think about unemployment, we worry about inequality, we worry about the rainforests, we worry about the ecosystems, services that are being degraded in various parts of the world, in particular our own part of the world. In my case, it would be India, maybe, it would be England. In your case, it would be this vast and beautiful country. And you have views about that. And the point I'm trying to make is that those views are not exclusively colored by your own private interest. So we, some parts of the day, act as citizens, and it is that particular posture that I want to work with you through. And by citizen I mean that you give some weight, a hopefully adequate weight, to others, not only those who are alive today, but those who will come after us. Most of them will come after us, by the way. A few will come even while we're alive. And when you're in your 30s, you start thinking about your children's future. And when you come to my age, you worry about beyond even your grandchildren's future. They are part of the public over which we want to think in terms of. We want to reflect on what is in store for them. Now, just historically, it happens in personal history, I got very interested, deeply interested in environmental matters way back in the 70s. It wasn't, I'm very urban by upbringing, so it wasn't really a love of nature, but it struck me as being really quite remarkable that a whole body of economic theory and application was being built upon a conception of growth which did not have in its productive base nature's capital assets. At the time I'm talking about, the economy was seen almost exclusively, and I say almost, but for our purposes of approximation, with 10% error, let us say, I'm quite accurate. Exclusively, it was produced capital. Buildings, roads, machinery, the whole works. The stuff that we create. In fact, when we think of investment, if you close your eyes and say, what does investment mean? You think of tractors, bulldozers beating up places, and then people in hard hats laying tarmac. So it's a very active view. It's a very positively aggressive attitude towards transforming the landscape into something else. And of course, it's very productive. It's a good thing. Roads are good. People can communicate, can move, and so forth. On the other hand, of course, there is a huge amount of natural capital, which at that time was being ignored. So, gradually, the idea was to chip over the years into redoing economics. By that, I don't mean redoing the logic of economics, because we are very fortunate, those of us who are economists here, to have inherited a subject to which some of the greatest minds of all time have contributed. People like Adam Smith, David Hume, are not negligible people. In our own time, people like Paul Samuelson, Kenneth Arrow, can stand against the best minds in any discipline. So we've inherited a very fine, very extremely good language with which to think about issues that we care about. The question is, are we applying that language in the right way? And what I want to do in the rest of this lecture is to take you through a class of questions. And then I want to give a spirit of how to narrow down the questions to a point where you can start getting some quantitative feel, so that you go beyond pure description. So this lecture is going to be about economic evaluation. And in economic evaluation, there are two aspects which I want to distinguish. Then the first, how do I move slides? Oh, I've got something here. Is that the thing I'm showing? Nothing is happening. Here we go. I got it. I got the right. I'm technologically backward. Right. So I said this: we evaluate economies. We are concerned with economic evaluation in this lecture, and we evaluate economies so as to assess and prescribe And I want to distinguish these two words, assessment and prescription. And we do so because we are curious to know the answers to 5 questions as citizens in the morning when you're having breakfast. Question A, how is the economy doing? B, how has it been doing in recent years? C, what should our forecast for the economy's performance be under business as usual? D, how is the economy likely to perform under alternative policies? And E, which policies should we recommend? If you think about it, these 5 questions pretty much exhaust anything you really want to ask about an economy. Bear in mind that by an economy, I do not necessarily mean a nation. I could talk about a household, I could talk about the state, I could talk about the district, a region, and sometimes when we are feeling particularly international, we think of the economy as the world as a whole. And we ask ourselves, how is the world doing? Is world distribution of income or wealth reasonable? Are they moving in the right direction? And so forth. So from now on, although at the end when I give you some data, they will be concerned with data regarding, in particular, in this case, Brazil. I will be quoting out of a paper that I was co-author of last year, and Brazil was one of the countries that we studied, and I'll come to that at the end. But for the theoretical part of this talk, you should not think that the economy means a nation. You could be thinking of your neighbor even. So how is my neighbor doing? How has my neighbor been doing in recent years? How is she likely to perform under alternative policies, like maybe she should study harder, or and so forth, okay? Now, questions A and B direct us to assess the performance of economies. And remember what A and B were? How is the economy doing and how has it been doing in recent years? So that's like an assessment. And when you read newspapers in the morning, very often, particularly in the business section, you're getting answers to questions A and B. This country is performing in this particular way, or and so forth. Okay? At the time I was growing up as a graduate student, assessment was less prevalent than it is now. The World Development Report of the World Bank annually produces assessments. If you look at the back pages with the tables, they'll be telling you, giving you data on GDP growth rate, employment, foreign exchange status, and so forth. But they're descriptions of the way the economy has been performing over the past 2 years, 3 years, 20 years, and so forth. So those are questions A and B. Questions D and E, on the other hand, are prompted by the need to prescribe policy. Because any change in policy is a perturbation to business as usual. Answering C, what should our forecast for the economy's performance be under business as usual, is essential if we are to respond to questions D and E. I want you to remember this distinction. We are to imagine that there is a forecast under business as usual. Now, business as usual doesn't mean that the rules of the game do not change. It's not as though government policies, if we were interested in the progress of a nation, that the government policy remains constant. But if you're a political scientist, or if you're not a political scientist, you talk to political scientists, they will say, well, we would expect, say, greater democracy to emerge because people are getting more educated, the economy is growing richer, and so forth. So the forecast business as usual could include your forecast of the co-evolution of the politics and economics of the economy that you're concerned. Okay? So it's not a static story. It's based on a forecast. Policy change means a change in the forecast. And a policy change could be change in the tax rate, could be change in property rights, could be even a project, e.g. buying up a piece of land and then deciding to do something with it, preserve it, conserve it, and so forth. And those two are seemingly very different questions. A and B are about assessment, C and D are about prescription. Both involve evaluation, because you are evaluating the economy under changes. So policy analysis addresses questions B and E, and the idea is to evaluate an economy at a point in time, before and after a hypothetical change has been made to it, so as to judge whether the change is desirable. Okay, so that seems quite intuitively obvious. However, the notion of sustainable development, and I introduce it here because it's the term that lies at the base of much environmental concern, historically speaking, that is. The idea that growth in GDP might not lead to sustainable development because you're cutting into something very important in the process of growing through GDP. So that's why I'm introducing the notion of sustainable development here. It's prompted by questions B and C. The idea is to evaluate change when the change is brought about by the passage of time itself. Now, what does that mean? It's pretty straightforward, so let me try and explain it very briefly. When you ask whether a particular policy, business as usual, leads to sustainable development, the presumption is, at the back of your mind, the following question. Remember, the word sustainable means that whatever that object is should not deteriorate over time. To sustain something means it must be preserved, at least preserved. It might grow, but it should not decline, otherwise it wouldn't be sustained. Should I be pressing something? I've lost. So when we ask the question whether an economy is pursuing a sustainable development path, we're asking whether, as time moves, something about that economy hasn't declined. And what that something is, of course, is the basis of my lecture today. Okay? So when we talk about sustainable development, we will be talking about some object out there which we wish to study, whose value should not decline over the period that we study. Okay? Whereas when you do policy analysis, you're essentially looking at the change in the economy being brought about by that policy at the time that you are undertaking it. Of course, the policy will have long-term consequences. That's not being denied. It's not a static issue. But the change is taking place at the point that you are studying. So if the finance minister changes the tax laws, the enactment takes place now, and it has a consequence into the future, and you want to ask whether, in some sense, it was a good thing or a bad thing in your role as a citizen. So now evaluation, whether it's sustainable development or assessment, or whether it's policy analysis, involves a prior notion of human well-being, because you want to ask, what is the currency with which we judge whether development is sustainable or whether the policy change is acceptable, desirable, supportable? And there are two ways to measure human well-being. One is to study the object itself. A colleague was asking about happiness indices, which you've been reading about probably in the last year or two. And happiness index is a constituent of human well-being if you think happiness is part and parcel of what makes for a good life. Some would say life expectancy itself is an object, direct component, constituent of well-being. If you think you have a long life ahead of you, your state of mind, your assessment of what your life is about will be different from the case of a shortened life expectancy. So that's one way of measuring. And the other is strange, but we do it all the time, which is we measure instead the commodity determinants of well-being. Ask yourself what GDP amounts to. So it's an object which gives economists a bad name amongst other disciplines, because they say, well, happiness or human well-being doesn't depend on goods and services. They're the means, they're not the end. And we shouldn't make commodities the end. But a good economist would never say the commodities are the end. They're the means. You need nourishment in order to be able to flourish. So the nourishment is the means, and so forth. So there are two ways of measuring it. And income is one, and that's one of the part of the determinants. And I want to take that commonality, and I show you how you can do it either way in a minute. Eliciting well-being. We economists and philosophers have made for many, many years actually, have tried to see how to elicit the well-being of a person. Remember, I'm skirting the notion of what constitutes well-being. And that's a good thing, because it's something which has engaged the minds of some of the most profound thinkers for, well, over 3,000 years, at least of recorded history, in the East as well as in the West. I'm skirting around, and the reason is that you'll see in a minute why. One class of question, one way of eliciting, is to ask directly, what is the human good? If you read Aristotle, that's directly what he's engaged with. What makes for a good life? What is the kind of life that you should strive to? What is the kind of person you should strive to be? Because it's in personhood lies the good life. Second question, what do people care about? That's different from what is the human good, because we could be caring about things that are ultimately perhaps not the most important. So these are distinct commodities, but there are different ways of cutting into this question. Third, what do people say when asked how they are or how they feel? That's a more empirical way of trying to elicit human well-being. And in today's empirical tradition, of course, this is a very common and popular way of doing it. People ask. There are questionnaires. There are surveys. People are asked questions about what matters to them. And the answers are not very surprising. Employment matters, meaningful job, good family life, friendships. Interestingly, the answers people give are not very different from the answers which great philosophers have tried to tease out from asking question one. In Aristotle, friendship becomes a very central part of the human good. And people do respond like that. So these methods of eliciting human well-being, while seemingly different, are not giving us very, very different answers. Another fourth is, what considerations do people take into account when choosing? So it's one thing to say, how are you feeling? Do you feel happy? Do you feel contented? Do you feel stressful, anxious, and so forth, which is question number 3. There is question number 4, where you're asked, what considerations do you take into account when choosing your job, for example, or refusing a job at a time when the labor market is tight, and so forth. And finally, this is the one which you undergraduates and graduate students are most familiar with, is to try and infer well-being from what people actually choose. This last method is called the method of revealed preference. And we try and judge people's welfare by their behavior in the area where revealed preference is strongest in the marketplace. But of course, you could and you should look at choice in the political sphere as well, not just in the marketplace, to see how people, what matters to people. So the 5th is a very important method that economists have devised, and it has serious weaknesses. And I'll come back to that if we have time, particularly if you would like to, those of you who are thinking of doing research and those who are doing research and looking for problems, at question time maybe ask me about the weaknesses of number 5, because I think we have been badly misled by answers to them, for reasons that I will give you if we have the time. Okay, so these are 5 methods, and for actual practical methods of evaluation, which is what I'm concerned with here at the end of this talk, we cannot be choosy. We have to rely on all five. You cannot be methodologically pure. You're going to get wrong answers no matter what you do. The idea would be to grab what you have and use your sense to come up with an answer to economic evaluation. The question being either sustainability analysis or policy analysis. What's the language to use? Okay. So the object of interest is human well-being now and the future. Intuition. A suitable measure of an economist's productive base can be used to judge human well-being. That's an intuition. It's an intuition which we economists have used for a long time, have relied upon for a long time when we use GDP or the Human Development Index and so forth. GDP in particular, because it's saying by looking at the volume of goods and services that are produced, we can have some sense of well-being in the economy we are studying. Otherwise, you can hardly use GDP as the benchmark with which to judge the performance of economies. Of course, I'm going to be arguing against it, but what I am trying to do now is to show that, yes, we have been using the determinants of well-being as a way to judge well-being itself. Determinants being commodities, goods and services. Okay? Now, GDP, of course, just reminding you, GDP consists not only of consumption but also of investment. The weakness that we'll be talking about is that it's a gross investment. But leaving that aside for the moment, investment means expanding the productive capacity of the future. If you have a high investment rate, it means you're actually accumulating capital, which means you are taking into account future people. So bear that in mind. That's not the weakness of GDP. The weakness lies elsewhere, and it's very significant. And I'll come back to that. So that's the intuition. The intuition is that if you're interested in whether a policy change is a good one or a bad one, or whether you're interested in asking whether Brazil has been following a sustainable development path, you would be asking something like whether the productive base of Brazil has expanded either due to the policy change or due to the passage of time. That's the intuition. Now, it's a big step from moving from that intuition to doing something with it. So imagine that you have adopted a conception of intergenerational well-being. And for those of you who are economists here, the standard one that economists use is, of course, the present discounted value or not discounted value of the floor of utilities. Okay? But nothing that I say depends on that specification. You'll be glad to know. You could take a Confucian view of human life, you could take a Christian view of human life, you could take a utilitarian view of life, or you could take a rights-based view of human life, and yet you will still get proposition 1. And here's the proposition. It says intergenerational well-being increases over a period of time if and only if a suitable measure of the economy's productive base increases over that same period. It's an equivalence result. It says there is a way of measuring the productive base such that we keep a monitor of it. And if it expands, then we can be reasonably sanguine that intergenerational well-being has increased. In the policy side, we will not be looking at over a period of time, we'll be asking whether the productive base has expanded due to the policy change. Okay? Proposition 2 follows from proposition 1, not trivially, but it says that the measure of productive base, with the property mentioned in proposition 1, is an inclusive measure of wealth. And so I could have called this lecture, I have been calling it the national wealth, but that's the idea. Notice, wealth is very different from income. Wealth is a stock. Income is a flow. And it's the stock that you should be concerned with, and it's very intuitive. that we should be carrying in our head the idea of a stock as to whether that's expanding or not. It is to me a remarkable fact that all these decades we've forgotten this insight and that we've been going in flow measures, whereas when we ask ourselves whether we have passed our examination, we recognize that our stock has expanded, either as a signaling device for the rest of the world or that we are more educated or whatever. We are concerned with stocks. Now, of course, the idea is going to be to try and measure that stock. But the thing is, wealth is a stock, and we should be talking about the wealth of nations, not the GDP of nations, not the Human Development Index of nations, and so forth. So that's proposition 2. But some propositions 2 and 1 are, remember, equivalence results. They are if and only if statements. Notice proposition 1. It's an if and only if statement. It says nothing about the world. It's a theorem which you use to judge whether, in an application, whether the world has improved or not, the economy has improved or not, whether a policy change is a good thing or a bad thing. But as it is, it's simply equivalence result. All right, so little formulations so that the undergraduates can feel happy, they're not going away with just words. So imagine that KIT is the stock of capital asset I, and PIT is a value that you attach to it, which I'm going to call a shadow price. Then wealth is simply the sum of the values of all the capital assets. That's equation 1. And if V at a date T denotes intergenerational well-being at time T, then propositions 1 and 2 together say the rate of change in V equals the value of the change in wealth. Okay, so that's proposition 1. A more general way of putting it, and this equation number 3 is about as general a statement that you can make, and I'm particularly fond of it because it, to me, unifies 2 streams of evaluation: sustainability analysis and policy analysis. It says that any change, a perturbation to the wealth of a country or a nation, an economy, is equivalent to the perturbation to intergenerational well-being, whether it's happening through time or whether it's happening through a change in policy. So this is the general statement. And as a footnote to students here, and I like to think this will be new to you. So when you study in your courses on project evaluations, investment criteria, and you are asked, how should I judge whether a project, an investment project, is a good thing, or a desirable thing, or an undesirable thing? What criterion do you actually use? You might use, let's think of a completely deterministic world, just for the sake of argument. Then you won't be worried about risk and so forth because you're looking at a deterministic one. It's a useful benchmark because if it's obviously when it's risky, you need to find some ways of measuring that risk. So in a deterministic world, one cut and dried method is to look at the rate of return on the investment. You're happy with that? A more sophisticated method is to look at the present discounted value of the flow of benefits from the project. If it's a commercial firm, you'll be looking at the commercial profits, the flow discounted value of the net profits of the project. But if it's a public project, you would probably be more subtle and say, well, no, commercial profits are not what's important. We want to look at social profits, where shadow prices come in. But nevertheless, you'll be looking at the present discounted value of the flow of social profits using shadow prices. You're happy with that? Now, what proposition equation 3 is telling us is that that old familiar formula, present discounted value of the flow of profits, if you like, is nothing other than the change in the wealth of the economy. In the case of a commercial firm, it will be the change in the value of the firm, in ideal circumstances, of course. In the economy, it will be the change in the wealth. So something that you've been all very familiar with all this time is actually part of the wealth calculation. bear in mind that when you calculate the present discounted value of the flow of profits, that's a stock, because you're summing flows. You're adding flows across time, remember? So that's a stock. So you're dimensionally okay. All right, so that's just it. Now the question is, how do I think of the productive base? I have the intuition that it's a productive base. We have a theorem about wealth. There are capital assets, but I haven't said what capital assets are. I've arbitrarily thought of capital assets and their social values, and I've defined wealth as the value of the total stock of assets, and claimed that changes in that value are the way to measure progress or regress of nations. My own interest in this whole area started with a curiosity of number 3, natural capital. But I had no idea at that time when I started working in this in 1972 that it would become such a complicated and difficult area. It involves, I've got interested in because in 1973 December there was an oil price rise of 4-fold, and people got interested in the scarcity of stuff, subsoil resources. So I've got subsoil resources here, but of course the most interesting issues crop up, much more subtle than subsoil resources, are the services that nature provides, ecosystem services in general. Wetlands, watersheds, ponds, lakes, fisheries in general, all that stuff out there which is producing goods and services for us to enjoy. I will not go through why market prices don't exist for many of those services, and which is the reason why we have to care as citizens, and we have to go beyond the market system to resolve the problems that these arise. But natural capital is going to be one part of our productive base. Working upwards, another which is far more studied, partly because the United States, colleagues in the United States have studied them, and that sets the tone of much research, human capital. This is not new to you. Human capital consists of health, knowledge and skills, and population. I would say on the whole that health has been underplayed in the human capital literature. The human capital literature has spent much time estimating the stock of knowledge in the form of skills and education, and changes in that stock. Okay? And I'll come back to that. And population size and composition is obviously part of natural capital, of human capital. And the first category is produced capital, roads, buildings, machinery, and equipment, which is the bread and butter thing. I should point out that if you look at national accounts, in national accounts, when national accountants mention investment, they mean investment in what? Produced capital. It is remarkable to me that education expenditure is regarded as consumption items. Health expenditure is seen as consumption items. Certainly when you look at household expenditure, you will find that when your parents spend money on your medical care, it's seen as part of consumption. And that seems odd, given that your health is an asset that you own. So an improvement in health, or put it this way, a non-deterioration in your health, should be seen as an expansion or not a deterioration in a stock, and therefore should be seen as an investment activity. Consideration 2 and 3 suggest that when we talk about investment, the intuitive notion of investment is any action which increases future consumption. So letting a fishery alone so the stock increases is an act of investment, because the stock grows. Not to cut down a rainforest for a year is an act of investment. It's a very passive act, but it's an act of investment because the stock will grow. Okay? So rethink the notion of investment. It's very easy. You simply want to study the stocks and see whether the stocks have expanded or declined. It doesn't matter how that has happened, whether it's an active action on your part or a passive action of letting things be. Okay? So, as I say, introducing 2 and 3 already takes us away from national accounts in a big way. It tells us that, quite apart from measuring wealth, you need to reclassify the accounts. I should say the last 2 years I've been involved in the writing of a report for the government of India on greening India's national accounts. And in the process of doing that, I have learned a great deal of the way national accounts are prepared. And the logic, the momentum that led to the creation of the national accounts are different from the momentum that I'm advancing here, because we want national accounts to do something for us. We want them to be able to give us information that we as citizens can use to judge whether things are improving or deteriorating, or whether policies are good or bad. They should be meant to serve us, not be created ab initio. So, as I say, human capital and natural capital have to connect. What about other kinds of capital assets, you might ask? I have in some ways given you an arbitrary list. And what about institutions? What about knowledge, natural laws, algorithms, theorems, social narratives? What about social capital, the law, social norms, habitual practices? What about maybe even time, exogenous changes that take place without our doing anything about it? But most important, institutions, property rights, firms, governments, and households. And today, we tend to use the term capital for anything that looks durable. So we talk about institutional capital, religious capital, social capital, cultural capital, and so forth. Why aren't they assets? But of course they are. They are assets. But the way I've defined wealth is to think of these latter categories as enabling assets. They give value. If the institutions are good, the same piece of object will have a greater value than it would if the things were bad. A country which is under civil war, even a laptop has small value. The same laptop as it would have been if the country was not under civil war. But one is usable, and the other case is unusable. Which means what? It means its price is different, shadow price is different. So when I talk about enabling assets, I mean those assets which are actually awarding value to the objects which are on my list of capital assets in this equation. So don't go around saying, well, let's try and measure the cultural capital stock of Brazil. Don't do it, because it's a non-starter. What is important is to recognize that the cultural capital of Brazil imparts value to all the things you care about, the things that you use all the time. If Brazil was in a state of chaos, those same objects would be worthless, or far less. Okay? So that's the setup. I could go on, obviously, but I have to move on. Now, what I'm going to do in the next 5-10 minutes is 5 minutes actually, and then we can have a discussion if you wish to. I want to put this to use. We were, a number of us, Kenneth Arrow and Larry Goulder at Stanford, Kevin Mumford and Kirsten Olsen were graduate students, about the same age as many of you here. Some 8-9 years ago when we started this research project, we were all slow. It turned out to be much harder than we thought, collecting data and making sense of them. But the paper was eventually published. It was published last year, and what I want to do is to give you some data on our findings on the context of Brazil. We looked at 5 countries: Brazil, China, India, Venezuela, and the United States. And we chose these 5 countries only to give some variation in either the state of development, India versus the United States, China, different kind of political regime, Venezuela because it's sitting on a lot of oil, and Brazil because it's shrouded by some of the most glamorous natural beauties. So these were the 3 countries. Now here's the sad news. Sad news in the sense that somebody at my age feel particularly, I wouldn't say unhappy, that's too deep a state of mind for, but in some ways missed opportunities. Everything we have done now, we could have in principle done 30 years ago. And we should have been far ahead in our understanding of the way economies actually perform. The numbers I'll be giving you are hugely biased, and they're not to be believed, except very partially. And the reason they're biased is that many of the things that we really care about in trying to estimate, of whose shadow prices we wish to estimate, we simply had no data. But the Brazilian case is particularly sad because you're sitting on top of the arguably the greatest stock of natural capital on Earth. I mean, your biodiversity, and we are unable to value it. There are no data on it. What we do, there are items of natural capital that are can be measured, imperfectly of course, but still there's an attempt at it. There's land, to the extent, and this is mainly agricultural land, or farming land, or ranching land, okay, not carbon in the atmosphere, because there have been estimates, many people have been working on the carbon problem, and so there are estimates of shadow prices, and I'll be talking about a range in a minute. Forest cover, but valued by timber value, which is a huge underestimate, because the forest gives you a lot more things than timber. If anything, cutting the timber goes against many of the natural benefits we get from it. In fact, you destroy the forest, at least the bit that you have cut. So we have an enormously unsatisfactory measure, and oil and minerals. That we have market prices for, and we have no particular reason to think that they are badly destroyed. So this is this sad news. We have enormously inadequate measure of natural capital, but we have tried using those. The shadow price of carbon, which I'll be using for this lecture, is $50 per ton. We did one thing very good. Those of you who wish to have a look at the paper, you'll find that we did a considerable amount of sensitivity analysis, which meant that we took various different values and see how the results turn out. So we not only used $50, but we went up to $500. Not because we would be believed if we used $500 per ton. By the way, it's a negative price, of course, you realize. This is carbon in the atmosphere, carbon, global climate change. So the asset is a bag at current concentration levels. So when I say $50, it's minus $50. So if concentration goes up by a certain amount, that multiplied by 50 is to be deducted from the change in wealth. Okay? Remember the sign here. There, the delta Ki could be negative. And when that is the case, then of course the wealth declines. Pollutants and carbon concentration you're measuring as capital assets would go up, but then the price will be negative. And so therefore an increase means a decline in the value. Is that all right? Okay. Sorry. So what we did, let me come straight to the Brazilian data, recognizing that we are going to have natural capital, those subset of things that I mentioned. We did health, knowledge, and we normalized for population size by looking at wealth per capita, change in wealth per capita. Produced capital is pretty straightforward. National accounts have it, so we use the national accounting system to estimate net investment. So what we are doing is to look at net investment per capita over a period of time to see whether the Brazilian economy has progressed or regressed over the period. The period we studied was 1995 to 2000, so it's a 5-year period, and we made use of the data that we just now mentioned. In the case of health, because I'm going to give you a result which will knock you out, it certainly knocked us out, because it was a complete surprise. And then I'll wrap it up by making some speculations as where I think the data are going to, what the findings are going to be when we have better data. For health, we did not, health is very interesting, and that's really a lot of work that can be done. It is a very fortunate, but in some deep sense, accidental good fortune of humanity, that good health or improvement in health has joint benefits. So if you have running a fever, taking medication and getting better makes you feel better. And meal tastes better if you're not feeling ill. So it's a direct benefit. The value of consumption goes up. But of course, it also is the case that it makes you more productive. If you're ill, you can't do much work. So that's another joint product. And recent work in epidemiology tells us that it also affects our life expectancy. Too many injuries to the health reduce life expectancy. So you're getting a joint product. What we have estimated is only the last thing. We have not measured the improvement of health in terms of current benefits. Productivity, yes, we have, because it's based on forecast of produced capital assets and so forth. But what we've tried to estimate is the life expectancy increase, which all the countries in our sample had experienced. The country which, there have been countries where, by the way, in recent decades, life expectancy has gone down. Ex-Soviet Union is the major case. And if we had done this there, we would have probably found a very different answer. But anyway, we're looking at Brazil here. How do we measure the value of life expectancy? What we've done is to use the value of a statistical life. Okay? And that brings us back to measuring eliciting well-being, because the value of a statistical life is inferring the value of a statistical life on the basis of human choice. How much additional wage or salary would you demand for taking an additional risk of death? So the value of a statistical life is the amount that you're willing to pay, the average person is willing to pay, to reduce the risk of death by 1 unit. Okay. And there's a big literature on that. We are not commenting on it. We've taken the data straight from the literature. The PSL value of statistical life in Brazil is estimated to be $2.5 million. It's large. And by the way, it's not a value of life. It's a value of a statistical life, which makes a lot of difference. So you're not saying that a human being is worth 2.5 million. That's rubbish. This is a value of an one arbitrary person whom you do not know. All right, so let's have a look at, I thought if we had time, I'd show you some proper theory, but we don't have time, so I'm going to skip all that. Table 1, and I'll just finish now, and there are just 2 tables, and this is what's knocked me out. Composition of wealth per capita in Brazil in 1995. It's not a change, but we're trying to estimate the stock of wealth per capita in Brazil. And it was $10,700 produced capital, natural capital $16,700, human capital education $44,000. Now look at human capital health. It's an order of magnitude higher. It's huge. It's a Professor Arrow, who wasn't born yesterday, he'll be 92 this year, and has seen pretty much the whole of economics pass through his hands, was completely astonished when we came up with this number. And then we kept on going through, and we now then realized the logic of the exercise gives it, because VSL is very high. So the total is 2.5 million composition of wealth per capita. Now you can see immediately where the errors lie. Natural capital is hugely underestimated because most natural capital is not valued. We haven't got the data on it. So for Brazil, that's of course a real tragedy, because you're sitting on the richest, I was going to say gold mine, natural mine in this world. And yet most of it we cannot measure. So as I say, this is literally a way, as a first step in what is likely to prove to be a long research project, but taken by several generations, I would imagine. But my educated guess is that in the foreseeable future, it will be natural capital and human capital in the form of health which will dominate our understanding of the wealth of nations. And one message we immediately get is how unimportant produced capital is. Because there's not much error there. We are using these are the official statistic of produced capital. Okay? Natural capital declined, not surprising. There has been a good deal of deforestation here. Plus, of course, subsoil resources, which are. Human capital is expanded. Human capital in health has expanded quite a great deal. Notice the percentage change is small for human capital in health. And that's because the base is large. Base is so large that even though it's 33,000, it turns out to be a small proportion. And then you have carbon damage and so forth. So the total change is 33,000, and it's 1.3% percentage change over a 5-year period. So you divide by 5 to get an annual change in per capita wealth in the country. Now I will stop here, but you can see what steps are. We started with high theory, very abstract theory. And the idea is to see how to discipline the way you collect data to serve the purpose that you have in mind as a citizen commenting on trying to understand the way the economy you want to study is working. Okay? In the process, we've discovered that we have long ways to go. And in fact, some of the most interesting things, the important things that actually led me to this area are missing. So in one way, this research has been a great disappointment to me. It's been a disappointment because I can't come with some dramatic story of the loss of biodiversity valued, for example, in the way we economists would like to see valued. For the moment, we simply have to rely on ecologists, environmental activists, to constantly put pressure on universities and the state to improve the way we measure these objects, to get some idea of a value. These values are always going to be within ranges. They will not be point estimates. So one of the things I'm going to be emphasizing in the report, as chairman, I have some prerogatives in the report that I mentioned for the Indian government, will be that national accounts should not be presented as numbers. They should be given as bands. And citizens should be educated to accept the fact that we don't really know very much. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Partha. And so we open the floor now for questions.
I see a problem with the question of differentiating between national accounts and international accounts, meaning that what is the shadow price that we should use, for instance, for the value of the Amazon forest? Is it the Brazilian one? Is it the value that we have in Brazil? Or is it the international one? And it's very sensible. It's very sensitive to what other countries do, such like China, for instance. If China starts to grow very much and starts to be less concerned with environmental policies, it's going to increase the price, and there should be a system of compensations in order to think about that. And I think that you would also include any type of political power, such as military power or reputational power or colonial power in the enabling assets, right? Okay, so if you take, for instance, the value of the military power in the United States, so if you take the 7th Fleet in Asia, it's not only the United States that accrues benefits from that, but it's also a local peace that is enabled by a kind of umbrella policy. So how do we deal with these things?
That's a terrific question, and but I'm particularly pleased that you've asked, because I think I know how to answer it. Which is the following. In this exercise, and the corresponding problem to the one you just now mentioned about the Brazilian forest lies in carbon. We don't have anything on Brazilian forest other than timber, but we do. I used a $50 per ton for carbon, didn't I? So carbon will have a very similar problem. So the carbon concentration, because it's a public bag sitting out there. All right. So the way we did it was the following. It's important, those of you particularly who are studying economics would feel that the moment you mention shadow price, it must be associated with an optimizing economy. because shadow prices technically are Lagrange multipliers and they are associated with optimizing exercises. In the theorems that I mentioned here, the great merit of the theorems is that they do not assume that the economy is optimizing. It's important because I come from India, and it was important for me that I should be able to develop welfare economics, which would be relevant even in a dysfunctional society. So you could be in the Congo, but suppose you are one honest civil servant sitting in an office in Congo, and a project falls on your lap, and you have some reason to believe that your recommendation, for some absent-mindedness, may be accepted. You need a language, and you're concerned with Congo, and it's a lousy situation, so you need a language. We followed that language here in this paper. So we were studying the problem from the Brazilian point of view. The shadow prizes were for Brazil. Of course, actions of Brazil would have effects on other countries. Goes without saying, but that's when you do the international calculation. So the $50 that we used was for concentration of carbon globally. But what we did, there have been some estimates by Nordhaus and Boyer in looking at the regional impact of carbon concentration on particularly agricultural productivity, because that's the only thing that could actually handle. Although we know climate change can have devastating effect on fixed capital. Cities can get buried under the sea and so forth and so on. So we looked at the component of 50, which is attributed to the loss that would incur to Brazil, resulting from a global increase in concentration, because it's a global public bad. It's the average concentration which is affecting Brazil, but the value of that bad is Brazilian as opposed to the world. Okay? And then, of course, Brazil is also contributing to, and if other countries say, oh gosh, Brazil's deforestation is affecting our future productivity, the point you are making kicks in beautifully. Certainly Brazil should be compensated. No question about that. The theory of public goods tells us that. That's pretty straightforward. But what we are doing in this exercise is from the Brazilian point of view, okay? Not from the universal point of view. And we've done that for the whole lot. All of it was because the World Bank wants to do it from the world point of view. So that the difference is, what we did was to look at the change in the global concentration multiplied by the damage to Brazil as estimated by that change in concentration. What the World Bank did in a similar work, parallel work, was just the reverse. It said the damage that you should attribute to Brazil should be the amount of emission that Brazil creates, say through net emission through deforestation, multiplied by the global price. That makes no sense, because what Brazil is being affected by the average concentration, not by its contribution. After all, China is throwing a lot of carbon in, and that's affecting Brazil. And so we should be looking at it from Brazil's point of view. Of course, if you want to do the world economy, that's a different matter. Then you would be doing all the sums.
I have one I may have missed something, but since the size of human capital too, this is a double question. Since the size of human capital too is so huge compared to the other components, shouldn't we improve our efforts of only explaining this part and improving the ways of evaluating it instead of concentrating on different kinds that matter much less apparently from the quantitative side? And second, I may have missed again, perhaps, but is there a difference, a huge difference between Brazil and the other countries you studied with respect to the size of the human capital too and the other components?
It's remarkable, for India too. It's consequence of the high value of a statistical life. And this is the problem. I see human capital 1 as being underestimated because many of the externalities that are attached to education, particularly in the Indian context, it would be over-education of women, the empowerment, that class of issues are missed because the techniques we have for estimating the shadow price of human capital, education, are standard looking at wage differences as a consequence of education differences. And that's, of course, very limited. But when you do exercises like this, the first thing you realize is how many errors the calculations are prone to. But the errors you detect only because you know the theory well. And that's, in one way, the justification for doing good theory before you hit numbers, is that you know what the mistakes are, where the gaps are. And I think human capital, one, is underestimated. Natural capital, I don't have to speak any further, it's hugely underestimated. But I think the message is that produced capital has been overestimated. And the reason I think it's been overestimated in our perception, I don't mean in these numbers, no, I mean in our perception. If you look at politicians, their idea would be, well, maybe these days it would be education would be very high on the list of priority. But investment in produced capital is, otherwise it's hard to understand China, the policies of the last 30 years. And it may well be that that was misplaced, that the emphasis on the others others were undersubscribed, if you like. Question: should policies then therefore be shifted towards health? That's not clear, because if the stock is very large, we still want to know what, at the margin, what a dollar invested in health versus a dollar invested in education versus a dollar invested in protecting the rainforest, how they pan out in terms of change in the wealth. We haven't undertaken that exercise. In this exercise, it's simply what has happened to Brazil over a 5-year period. So that's sustainability analysis. But in policy analysis, although you'll be studying the same object, namely wealth per capita, you would be looking at the change that would occur as you shift resources from one activity to another and see which one is better. So we can't tell just by looking at the large component of human capital in health to see whether that's where the money should go. Okay.
Let me make a small comment here. I don't know if this work, but there are some economists that looked at the rate of return of investment in research, and they came to the conclusion that don't look at it, because if you look at it, you just invest everything in health research because of the return. The previous years have been so high in terms of expansion of the lifespan and so forth. That so people that did look at the policy issue, they came to the same conclusion. Human capital too is the place to look. I don't know.
Oh, no, you may well be right about that, and thanks for reminding me. Yes, there is work in there, but again, the one problem there, I think, was that the value of the statistical life that they were using was enormously much higher than at least some of the experts have suggested come from the data.
Yeah, talk about the work of pelo and okay.
Hello, my name is Adriana. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so in advance, I would like to apologize because I'm a lawyer. Maybe I won't use the correct economic terms. But my question is, following table 2 and following your question, and I'm sorry, is that I realize that the human capital 2, which refers to the health, and the total, which is the total change in wealth,
Right.
in table 2, they're very similar, the totals, so 33,400 and 33,465. And my question is, if this is a pure coincidence?
Sorry, which ones? I'm sorry, which numbers?
So human capital 2,
Yeah.
which refers to health,
Mm-hmm.
is 33,400,
Yeah.
and and the total at the end is 33,465. And my question is if it is a coincidence or if it actually indicates that the human capital 2, which refers to health, is a key factor measurement for examining the wealth. I'm sorry, the performance in wealth and.
No, you're right. What's happening is that the human capital 2 is dominating, as you can see. Even the change is dominated, and then there's been a slight cancelling off. Human capital 1 is positive 3,000, and then there are minuses in the others. So they're pretty much cancelling off. They're all second-order effects. The first-order effect is health. But I cannot insist more strongly that these numbers per se are just a way of illustrating how to go about doing it. I'm totally convinced that natural capital is highly underestimated, but it should be larger negative there.
Thank you very much.
You're right. Your intuition is right. That's how it's.
Good afternoon. I would like to know how efforts should focus on towards defining the value of natural capital. Today we have a lot of questions and a lot of policymakers asking us how to value these assets. So where should these efforts focus on in order to try to answer these questions?
It's again, lovely question. Thank you very much. This is a story of some. Since you've asked me, I'm going to expose my inner being, as my American friends every now and then talk about. Okay. Inner being. This is a story of real disappointment. All this work should have been done the last 25 years. This is not new. The fact that ecosystem services are the lungs of Earth, and without them we die, is not new. In any case, certainly economists haven't invented it. We learn it from being human beings, and then professionals who tell us about it. So how do we go about it? I think we have to tell politicians, if they're asking us, that they have to be patient and they must not expect answers on the spot, that they should allow for small-scale research, but in large numbers. So let me give you two examples. They are not, both of them taking place. One is in Indonesia, and the other is happening in quite a bit in Costa Rica and others. So let me take the one which I like particularly, because not many people have done it. But it's something which young economists, I would like to think, should be encouraged to work on. And then the other part of the frustration is, how do I get economics departments to respect this kind of work, so that they get people who work on this kind of thing get tenure? And that's for distinguished colleagues to decide, because that's important too, because incentives matter. And if young people don't feel that the research area is not to be rewarded. Okay. Youngish economist at Duke, Subrendra Patnaik, has worked with soil engineers, are major suppliers of hardwood to China and India. Okay. Now, the hardwoods some of the forests are in the uplands of watersheds. When that is deforested, it affects, theory suggests it's going to affect soil erosion, and therefore it's going to affect productivity of farmers downstream. Some 1990s, so since you did ask me a sensitive question and I'm laying bare my soul, in 1990 I published a paper in which I suggested that there is a hidden kind of wealth transfer from exporting countries to importing countries through precisely this mechanism. So the forest is being denuded because there's a demand for timber abroad. What used to be traditional people living there are no property rights. It's historical rights. But you know very well how, with the stroke of a pen, an enormous swath of tropical forest, rainforest, can become state property. Just one pen. And when it's state property, you can throw the people out, and then you can give a contract to a logging firm, and then business as usual. But now the price of timber, export price, will not cover the losses borne by those who are affected, and will not cover the losses downstream farmers and fisherfolk. Therefore, it's underpriced. Therefore, the part of Indonesian wealth is being given, handed over, free of charge, to China. And who's subsidizing it? Some of the poorest people in Indonesia. Patnaik has actually estimated this in one particular field study. Now, it's very hard to do it because you have hundreds and hundreds of farmers, and the productivity loss of different farmers are going to be different depending on where the farm is, what part of the slope the farm happens to be, and so forth. Heterogeneity matters, and details matter. But he's estimated that something like 15% of farmers' profits have been lost due to this export, deforestation. So this is a very interesting case of hidden wealth transfers, wrongly. And I think more needs to be done like that. I think it can be done. But this is one case study in all these years, and there should have been, by now, we should have had, since 1990s when the theory was being initiated, we could have had quite a number to get a feel for the order of magnitude. Another area which has received quite a bit of attention is pollination. And there are more, as you're probably familiar with this work, which is, and in Costa Rica in particular, the idea is to see the value of pollination from bees and flying objects, as we call them, in the forest to the farms. And you get a very beautiful exponential curve regarding the benefits to farms depending as a distance from the forest edge, because of course these pollinators, butterflies, birds, insects, they have a range. So the farther you are away from the forest, the less benefits you get. And what you can do is to plot the distance and the volume of traffic of the pollinators. Ecologists are well trained to do that, and then control for other differences to see differences in productivity of the coffee plantations as a function of distances. And you can then work out the value of the pollination, which is an externality which needs to be taken into account when you measure the shadow price of the forest, because that's providing the habitat for the pollinators. But of course it's being missed in the normal course of things. There are quite a number of others, such type of work, which are trying to estimate these spillovers that take place across property rights regimes to see how much we're missing. But the first one is really remarkable to me because it's a very dramatic way of seeing how mismanagement or not compensating the poor can mean that a country is giving up wealth. And if Indonesians were told and persuaded that actually you're giving your wealth away, or a certain part of your wealth away, to China, they wouldn't like that, right? Because it's bad news. But there's a long way to go.
Okay, please tell your name and before asking a question. Then I have afterwards a question here. Bring the phone after this. Okay? No, for him first. No.
My name is Pedro Melo. I'm from economics in FGV. First, I want to thank you about this amazing lecture. It's great work. And I have a little concern about you're measuring another ways to evaluate the capital of nations. So you put in natural capital, human capital, but how this can be capitalized? How can I make nations more wealth, or really the expenses of life, all the human indexes, and how can I develop nations if I'm putting so much weight on human capital or this kind of stuff that I cannot trade? I don't know. I'm thinking about I'm concerned about the liquidity of this kind of things, because when I have produce capital, I can sell, I can trade, I can lend, I can do a lot of stuff. But with health, there's most weight in your research. How can I materialize this kind of thing?
Very, very nice. So you're not planning to be a lawyer, are you?
No, thank you.
I hope not. We need more ecological economists in the world. Terrific question. There are many ways of tackling your question, so you'll have to forgive me if I'm giving you an incomplete answer. Maybe afterwards we can even chat. So what kind of policies would, remember, the unit of analysis here is the nation. And so you have something like the average person in mind, and of course if you're interested in distributional issues, which you should be, then remember everything I've said about wealth, you could then talk about correct it for the distribution of wealth, just as you do with GDP. You say, well, income, average income is high, but hey, the distribution of income is very bad, so you have a Gini coefficient or something to correct for that. Similar thing happens here. So for the country itself, for certain things like pollination and so forth, or the case that we studied about the upland forest timber affecting downland productivity, one of the surest way would be to improve the property rights in the economy. Because remember, the economy is the unit now. I mean, the nation is the unit. So the fact that some things can't be traded may be a problem for a person, but it should not be a problem for the economy, because although your health has improved, you can't trade your health, you can't sell your health to me, but you do something with your health, either because you feel better, you feel happier, you're willing to pay for it. Okay? That's the VSL, the value of the statistical life. So even though you can't trade the object, like your skill, you have a lot of tacit knowledge, which you can't trade directly. But indirectly you can, because you use your tacit knowledge to have, if it's recognized you have this tacit knowledge, additional tacit knowledge, you'll have a higher wage or whatever, or the pleasure of having tacit knowledge. For the economy as a whole, it does not matter whether a certain thing can be traded or it can't be traded, so long as the object can be made use of. So one would be property rights, improvement. Another, very important, are social norms of behavior. These can't be legislated, but they improve the performance or the value of the capital assets by changing their shadow prices. At lunch, I was giving an example to illustrate it, and since students you might find it very useful to see how the fact that some things can't be traded is not really a barrier to a problem of evaluation. So imagine, I was suggesting, imagine two islands which are identical, absolutely identical in terms of assets, capital assets, of the numbers 1, 2, and 3. But in one, there is no trust amongst people. And the other, there is trust, whatever reason. Maybe the law works well, the courts are working well, and so on. Then in the latter world, in the latter economy, trade will take place across goods, as households trade amongst one another because they can trust each other to believe in the promises that they make during the transactions. In the former, it's autarkic. Nobody's going to trade because nobody can trust. And so the capital assets 1 to 3 are going to be misallocated in 1 more than they would be in 2. Therefore, the value, the shadow prices of the same capital assets in 1, where they don't trust, will be lower than the one in the one where they do trust one another. So the other economy would be wealthier, even though they have the same body of capital assets, simply because their value is. So there are many ways in which one can think of making policy adjustments, strengthening the rule of law, giving appropriate incentives, and so forth. But if something can't be traded at all, it should be taken as a constraint on the basis of which the wealth is measured. I mean, you can't alter the facts of nature. Tacit knowledge is tacit knowledge. By definition, it cannot be translated. It's not like codified knowledge. Codified knowledge is what we are doing here now. It's codified, it can be transferred. I give a lecture, you go over with some additional insight, hopefully, and so forth and so on. But tacit knowledge is intrinsic to the person, and it takes years to translate tacit knowledge from one person to another. So if that's not possible, doesn't mean that it hasn't got value. But it's not possible, it's not possible. It's a constraint that the economy has to take in.
Okay, please say your name first.
Hello, Marina Drummond. I work here at FTV. I'm not an economist either, so I may say lots of silly things. I've been reading up recently on the work of Tim Jackson at Surrey, and he's been saying recently that green GDP, and just including all sorts of actual, be it ecosystem services or whatever, including all of those issues within a notion of GDP for the sake of argument, has become another distraction because it doesn't actually question the underlying model upon which our wealth and stability is today based. And he says that, I mean, the green growth idea has become sort of definition that it's a growth-based economy by increasing efficiency in resource use. But however, no model actually shows that sustained economic growth plus improving the situation of the poor and getting them up to a sort of Western level, and also meeting CO2 targets is actually possible. And so he sort of looks at whether or not there is a manner of sort of capital markets analysing if there could be an innovative green investment-led economy, and what would happen to public debt, public spending, household price, and all of that. And I was wondering whether your notion of inclusive wealth actually considers that sort of alternate model of an economy which analyses the real economy and the monetary economy, as opposed to just going for green growth. Thank you.
That's a hard one to answer because I'm not totally familiar with the nuances. I do know Tim, so we've had some chats about it, so I can't really address his, partly also because he's got very big think behind his work. You know? So I may be misjudging it. First of all, green GDP is a misnomer. It means nothing. It has no meaning at all. Because GDP itself is gross. Therefore, it doesn't take depreciation into account. So either you're not doing GDP, you're moving to something like net national product, net domestic product. Here, the point of the exercise is that is to try and get, as far as possible, the shadow prices to rule in the marketplace, quote unquote. When I say market, it could be, of course, these could be simulated markets. It's not sort of actual markets. If that were that easy, then we've been in the gravy, so to speak. So yes, when we talk about the wealth of nation, the propositions 1 and 2 are telling us that when we talk about economic growth, we should be talking about growth in wealth, per capita, adjusted for distribution, obviously. Everything's qualified by distribution issue, just as they are in any consideration, whether it's health, education, and so forth. Now, question, is it possible? The answer is, we don't know unless we have tried, because the reason behind this, why this theorem works, is that if you hit upon a bottleneck, if the cost, let us say the cost of maintaining your natural capital is real reduction in your produced capital, or the level of activity, economic activity as currently thought of. We don't know what the structure of shadow prices may look. It may well involve a huge change in our lifestyle, which I don't know if anybody has actually done any simulation with this kind of a theorem in mind to see what the world looks like. Now, there is a tendency, I think, to think that you can have your, what's the expression, have your cake and eat it too. In that, if you handle poverty, all will be well. Or that poverty eradication is equivalent to nature conservation and so on. In certain aspects of the situation, the answer must be yes. We know that for a fact. No question about it. It's some of the worst forms of natural capital destruction, at least in the Indian subcontinent and some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, which I'm familiar with, happen at the rural level. Because property rights of the indigenous people were violated, destroyed, and you couldn't defend the thing in any measure whether it's their income, whether it's natural capital preservation or sustainability of natural capital economy. But generally speaking, it's not clear whether it's possible. Now, if one of the costs may be having to give up high growth of consumption in Western countries. Maybe a trade-off that has to be done, but of course no country is going to do that. So we're looking at a very hypothetical scene. All that we can do is for each political unit to see how best to buffer itself through the turmoil that we're observing today in the world economy. Hopefully then, the nature of international negotiations, certainly over the law of the seas and climate change, suggests there is not much mileage there. So the news is very, at least at the moment, looks not very good. But the best we can do is for each unit to do the best it can, bearing in mind that at every stage there should be negotiations with others. And look, we are doing this, but you realize what we are doing is harming you. Or what you are doing, which is understandable from your point of view, is harming us. Perhaps we should negotiate over this. But aside from that, it's very hard to say what lifestyle for the world economy, in some sense, we would expect in 100 years' time if we want to live in a sustainable world. It's just too speculative for, at least for me, to feel comfortable with any scenario. This scenario seems to depend hugely on the mental state of the person who is drawing up the scenario. Some are born pessimists, some are born optimists, some middle of the road, and their scenarios differ quite a bit. So, I'm sorry, I don't think I can say very much more about it.
I think you have just got for one more question, or anybody.
My name is Vinicius. I am from the third semester of undergraduate in economics here, and I would like to know how that sources of wealth, in particular the human capital to wealth and natural capital, interact with each other. If the natural capital reinforces the human capital to health. Sorry.
Very good. Excellent. Yeah. So go back to your textbook and look at a production function. Study a production function, say f of k and L. Then k is affecting the productivity of L, and L is affecting the productivity of k. You're happy with that? It's a standard production function. So imagine it's Cobb Douglas or something. So each is affecting the other's productivity. If k declines, the productivity of L will be different. If L declines or grows, the productivity of k will be different. But still you can talk about the prices of each at the margin. Same goes here. Everything you know in economics is translated here. The only thing is the canvas is much bigger. It includes many things that are missing in your textbook analysis. But the idea that factors or assets affect each other's performance, particularly over time, which is the point you're just now making, and absolutely correctly so too. If the epidemiological environment improves, human health improves, and so forth. All that will be picked up in the dynamics of the economy that you're modeling. The sad thing is that economic models typically ignore the epidemiological environment, certainly the natural environment. And therefore you get a truncated vision of the way the productive base changes. And you get a misleading picture thinking that the productive base is expanding, whereas actually it may be shrinking without you knowing it. Because you're not measuring it. That's what he said. Okay, is that clear?
Thank you very much, Partha Dasgupta. Excellent exposition.